Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Steve Jappinga with the Lansing Regional Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for joining us this morning for this webinar on Governor Whitmer's state budget proposal. I know we have several folks still joining us coming into the Zoom room right now. Probably don't need to go over all the protocols since we're all pros at navigating Zoom. But there will be an opportunity closer to closer to the 11 o'clock hour for a Q&A with both Robert or Craig on any questions that you may have. If you've noticed on the left of your screen, we are recording this webinar and we'll make that available following this presentation on the budget. I'm going to hide my video, so you're not going to see me. And you're going to hear the voices of Robert and Craig, and again, appreciate both Robert and Craig from the Citizens Research Council of Michigan that are going to walk us through today's presentation on the governor's state budget. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Robert and Craig, and we'll get going. So thank you again for joining us, and the screen is yours.
Okay, good morning. Can everyone see my screen?
You get it. Can you share your screen?
Yep, I was.
There you go.
Okay, I don't know. First time it didn't work.
No,
everyone can hear me though, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thanks. So thank you, Steve, and welcome to everyone. Today's presentation. We appreciate you taking the time to join us this morning for our overview and analysis of the executive budget recommendation. My name is Bob Schneider. I'm a senior research associate here at the Citizens Research Council. Very excited. This is my second webinar and my third week back at the Research Council. Spent about 3 or 4 years at the Research Council several years back, and then did a 4 or 5 year stint at the State Budget Office, and just returning and excited to be contributing again to the mission of the Research Council. Craig and I, Craig Thiel is our research director. Craig and I are going to be spending about an hour highlighting some of the major pieces of the governor's budget recommendation, as well as talking a little bit about some of the early legislative response that we've seen this week to some of her supplemental proposals. We're going to talk about content of the budget, obviously, but we're also going to kind of step back and take a broader look, a high-level look at the state's budget position in general. And we will spend some time toward the conclusion talking about the new federal stimulus money coming into the state and what that might mean as well. As Steve said, we're going to leave some time at the end for questions and answers, and we hope we'll be wrapped up by 11:30 and let everyone who's interested in watching Spartan basketball get over to the game if that's in anybody's plans. Before we begin, I did want to talk a little bit about CRC. I hope many of you are already familiar with our organization, but if not, we're very proud to have celebrated our 100th birthday as an organization not too far back in 2016. We are a not-for-profit, nonpartisan policy research organization, and our mission, which I think is increasingly important today, is really to provide factual, objective research on public policy issues. With the goal of, one, informing policymakers and hopefully then promoting better policy making, and also informing the Michigan citizenry and be a source of objective information for those who want to learn more about public policy. We do rely on contributions for our operations, and we've appreciated a generous support from the business community, from foundations in the state, and contributions from individual citizens. I'd encourage you to take a look at our website, crcmich.org, and consider a donation. If you have some room within your charitable contributions, we would greatly appreciate it. Our presentation is going to be on. It is not yet online, but we will put this online later today. I know Steve's taping, so that may be less important, but if you do want to access the slide deck, you will be able to find it at our website under events sometime later this morning. So we thought it was especially important this year to kind of start out by actually taking a look backward and look back at 2020 and spend a little time on the state's response to the onset of COVID. Budget deliberations were dominated by, by coronavirus response, not only in dollar needs in terms of fighting COVID with testing and contact tracing, vaccines, healthcare capacity, but also obviously in addressing the economic slowdown that came with the stay-at-home orders and public health restrictions that were put in place to help stop the spread of the virus. And as we're going to see, the state's budget response last year has really shaped the current status of the budget situation, and not in ways that everyone was expecting actually back a year ago. And we'll dig into that a little bit more here in the first segment of the presentation. So let's start with just a quick reminder of how quickly the COVID-19 pandemic hit us last year. The governor's budget, FY21 budget recommendation, was released on February 6th. There was no funding for COVID in that budget recommendation back just over a year ago today. I actually went back and searched the executive budget booklet and background, and I didn't find any references to coronavirus, to COVID, to virus. It was pretty clean. I think back at that time, we still were thinking of COVID-19 as a kind of a Wuhan, China problem. That all changed within just 4 or 5 weeks, and we're actually presenting here on March 11th. We're bookended between 2 anniversaries. March 10th last year, just almost a year ago, the first presumed positive cases of coronavirus in Michigan. And then within days, starting on March 12th, K-12 schools closed, universities moving to online learning, and then the restrictions on large gatherings and the beginning of business closures the very next week. So by the end of March, regular budget work for the FY21 budget had largely stopped. The subcommittee meetings and in consideration of that FY21 proposal that had been released last February, and focus turned really exclusively to responding to COVID. Some initial state funding was appropriated in late March, and then we're getting ready to, budgeters got ready to respond to the slowing economy and its effects on state revenues. This slide shows just how big that revenue impact was expected to be. Here we see, just for background, twice a year, state economists from the legislature, from the administration, meet to come to consensus forecast estimates for revenues, and those really set guideposts on resources that will be available for the state budget. The blue bars here for our 2 major funds, our general fund, GP, general fund, general purpose revenues, and school aid fund, SAF revenue estimates are outlined here. And what you'll see is the picture in May was very bleak. Within these 2 major state funds, revenues were expected to be down by over $6 billion across the 2 fiscal years. And of particular concern, in the immediacy at least, was the fiscal year 20 budget, which was already 8 months in, was down $3.2 billion. And with those new consensus revenue estimates in May, with our state constitutional requirements, the state had to immediately then take action to bring the budget back into balance last summer. We did get some help from the federal government, and that was actually not only helpful in fighting COVID-19, but in addressing some of those budget challenges that the state was facing. I'm going to kind of outline 2 key areas of support that ended up helping immensely in filling that budget hole that we just saw was facing us last May. First, the federal government provided states from the Coronavirus Relief Fund, and for Michigan that meant $3.1 billion to the state. We had almost $800 million shared between our 4 largest counties in the city of Detroit. Initially, that CARES Act based funding was fairly limited to COVID response. So there was a concern that It was not flexible enough to, we could use it for testing and contact tracing, but not for shoring up our revenue shortfall. Eventually, there was some guidance that was very helpful to the state where those CRF funds, the coronavirus relief funds, could be used for state operations, public operations where COVID had really effectively transformed the daily course of business. And we ended up using significant CRF, as we'll see in the next slide, on things like state prison operations and K-12 schools, many other public functions. Another important source was, and this was the one place where the federal government helped with kind of direct budget relief to the states, was a boost in our state Medicaid match. As some of you may know, the state's Medicaid program is a federal state cost sharing program. The federal government, generally in Michigan, contributes about 2/3 of the cost. The state has to match the other 1/3. What the federal government did in the CARES Act was boost that federal share by about 6.2%, and it made it retroactive to the beginning of 2020. So instead of the state getting roughly 65% federal match, it went up to 72%. And for such a huge program, Medicaid program approaches $20 billion. That actually allowed a lot of additional federal support that helped offset general fund dollars significantly. So in July of 2020, the governor issued executive orders and other budget directives to solve that budget hole for the current year. And again, we were already 8 months in. After drawing down some available fund balances, the state had to cut about $2.4 billion. In this slide is a summary of how we hit that mark. Key takeaways here: those federal stimulus provisions we just talked about, the coronavirus relief fund and Medicaid match, really contributed to about $1.7 billion of meeting that reduction target. So about 2/3 of the reductions that were needed came directly out of that federal stimulus. In particular, that coronavirus relief funding was used to offset costs for public safety, state police, corrections staffing, K-12 schools who were focused, of course, on moving to online learning, universities and community colleges as well, local revenue sharing, and then other direct COVID response activities. We hit that mark both with that federal stimulus relief, and also pulled another $350 million from the budget stabilization fund. The remaining cuts, and they're about $450 million, and that's substantial, but they were largely one-time reductions, not much in terms of ongoing reductions to the state budget. So the stimulus and that withdrawal from the BSF really helped the state avoid the kind of substantial budget pain that was expected in May. And then things switched over. With the FY20 budget behind us, attention turned to 21, and by late summer, state economists were beginning to feel a lot better about state revenues. Revenues were forecast much higher than those initial May forecasts. So before the FY21 budget negotiations got underway, there was another revenue conference, and the news was very good here, especially for FY20. We had combined revenues being up $2.3 billion. That's the shift that you'll see from the gold bars to the black bars. Gold bars were the May estimates, black bars were the August estimates. So effectively, that now means we just cut, the state had just cut $2.4 billion in July. We were getting that all back in these new revised August revenue projections. And then further, FY21 revenues were up another $500 million, and the budget situation looked much better. The FY21 budget then, which looked like another mountain to climb, resolving that FY21 budget got much easier. The school aid fund now was not in a shortfall situation and actually had a surplus, allowed us to use about half that school aid fund surplus to provide increases for K-12 schools. The rest of that surplus then was used to offset general fund that had been supporting the K-12 budget. We shifted that over, and along with more Medicaid match support and more coronavirus relief fund support, we largely knocked out that general fund shortfall as well. So that 21 budget actually had substantial GF investments, and then those were made room for by budget reductions that had already been under consideration, as the state believed that, not that long before, that hundreds of millions of dollars were going to need to be cut from the 21 budget. So with the 2021 budget now in place, along with the 20 budget, we had another January consensus conference to get ready for FY22 budget deliberations. And what we saw here is, once again, revenues were up very significantly in the January consensus. And here we see the change from August to January, the black bars to the white silverish bars. In that consensus, revenues are up significantly again, $758 million in additional GF revenue, $1.2 billion for the school aid fund. All of that is now available to be appropriated either right away or can be added to for consideration in the FY22 budget. So before we then take that step forward and start talking about the FY22 budget, let's step back and look at what happened with those revenue projections. So first, some economic data helps illustrate the changing economic variables that factored into those forecasts. And this chart looks at three key economic indicators: total Michigan employment in the first set of bars, total wage and salary income, and then total personal income. So in January 2020, and those estimates that preceded the COVID pandemic, employment was forecast to be up slightly in Michigan by about 0.6%. Wage and salary income was up about 4%, and personal income was projected to be up 3.7%. All three variables were downgraded significantly in those May forecasts, but then things changed. You'll see, especially for wages and salaries and personal income, things got much, much better. Employment stayed down. So you see not much change in those bars. Final data show Michigan did shed about 420,000 jobs in 2020. So 2020 was not a good year employment-wise, but the decline in wages wasn't as great. You'll see the -9% became about -4.5% in January. The thinking there is employment declines were kind of concentrated in lower wage sectors, retail, restaurants, service sector, industries. So higher wage workers were more likely to keep their jobs and work remotely as needed. The employment declines were a little more focused on those lower wage sectors. The most surprising change was this growth in personal income. The 6% growth in personal income that was realized in 2020 actually is extremely high historically. We've only seen twice before. I looked back at data back to the year 2000. Only twice before have we reached 6% so 2020 was actually a banner year for personal income growth. Why? What happened to drive that type of personal income growth increase? Personal income, wage and salary income is what I earn from my job. Personal income includes a business income if I'm a sole proprietor, but also transfer payments like unemployment benefits. And we'll see, I think the major driver between that and what helped mitigate the loss of regular wage and salary income was the immense increase in unemployment benefits that we saw in 2020. And we know we had not only regular UI benefits, but the enhanced benefits provided by the federal government, originally $600 a week and then continued at $300 a week. We had federal work share programs that allowed folks to provide unemployment benefits for those who had reduced hours. And all told, a normal year for unemployment income, maybe we expend benefits in the magnitude of maybe $750 million. In 2020, it was just over $5.6 billion in unemployment benefits paid out to Michigan. So that personal income growth was not solely, but mostly driven by that factor. And so then what happened with revenues? We saw you know, not only those UI benefit enhancements, then helping with personal income and helping prop up, these charts are our two major state taxes, or personal income tax and sales tax. Both the enhanced UI benefits, the Paycheck Protection Program, the federal stimulus checks, and then the gradual reopening of the economy. You'll see the January forecast for 2020 look a lot more like the prior January's pre-COVID forecasts. We did have declines in revenue, but they were much smaller than what was originally projected. I think the key takeaway from this background is that federal stimulus kind of coming from all sides really helped shore up the state budget and help avoid the type of significant cuts that folks thought we were facing back last May. So with that background, let's turn to an overview of the FY22 budget proposal. We'll see, for the reasons we talked about, with those revenue upgrades that occurred in August and then again in January, we actually carry very large fund balances for both general fund and the school aid fund, combined at about $3.5 billion. On top of that, we are expecting, we talked about that enhanced federal Medicaid match. We're expecting additional savings during FY21 of over $700 million, general fund in Health and Human Services caseload programs, primarily Medicaid. And that's driven largely by that continuation of the Medicaid match. The Biden administration has signaled to states their intent to continue that enhanced match through calendar year 2021, and the $715 million in savings we show here is related to that intent. With all of this, fund balance, the governor in her proposals proposed to really draw on those fund balances to fund a lot of major one-time investments contained in FY21 supplemental requests. Craig's going to talk about some of those education-related requests shortly, and then I'll be reviewing some of the major GF supplemental proposals in the budget. So significant spending proposed in FY21 supplemental requests. The FY22 budget also has some significant growth in it. Here's just a big picture overview from sort of 15,000 feet up of the governor's 22 budget recommendation. The state budget under her proposal would grow to almost $66 billion. Up 6.4% from the current year FY21 budget. Federal revenue increases drive a big share of that. Federal revenue's up almost 10%. Federal stimulus obviously drives a lot of that, including the Medicaid match we talked about. Also, a lot of additional money in the budget to recognize federal food stamp, food assistance, benefit enhancements, and that factors into that big federal increase. General fund and school aid fund in 22 also up, by a healthy amount. 5% growth in the general fund, about 4% growth in school aid fund appropriations in the budget. So if we look at those major changes and try to bucket them up, what we'll see is this chart looks at our starting point of ongoing general fund and school aid fund appropriations in the 21 budget, and then what's changed, what are the increases if we need to break them up into categories. You'll see the increases on both the GF side and the school aid fund side. Roughly, just over half of them are related to new one-time investments that are being proposed in the FY22 budget. Almost $600 million on the general fund side and $266 million from the school aid fund. Craig's going to walk you through here momentarily some of the activity on the school aid fund side and I'll summarize some of the major one-time investments on the within the rest of the budget as we move on here today. Ongoing investments, at least on the general fund side, again, Craig's going to talk about the education component, but on the general fund side, almost $200 million in ongoing investments. But it's notable, probably about 2/3 of that, about $121 million of that ongoing investment on the general fund side is linked to one specific investment that we'll talk about in a bit, and that is the continuation of a $2 per hour wage increase for direct care workers in Michigan, who are kind of frontline workers who serve vulnerable populations in nursing homes and in the behavioral health arena. So fairly modest ongoing investments outside of that one big one. Okay, so I am now going to stop and turn my screen over to Craig. Craig Thiel, our research director, is going to walk us through some highlights in the K-12 and education arena. And so I'm going to stop my share and let Craig grab the screen, and Craig's going to pick up. So Craig, over to you.
All right, great, Bob. Thanks a lot. I'm assuming everyone can hear me, see my screen. I'm going to pick up kind of on the theme that Bob had laid out early on in terms of a look back at what happened with education funding over the 2020 year and how that has set the stage for the 2022 budget. So just as a reminder, Bob hit on a key point, which was kind of the timing of the doom and gloom state budget forecasts last May. Bob mentioned there were still 4 months left in the state fiscal year. A lot of the spending had already been done in the 20 budget, leaving difficult decisions if actual budget reductions were gonna happen. With K through 12 education, they end their fiscal years at the end of June, so there was less than 4 months. There was less than 2 months, in fact, to complete the FY20 budget year. At the time in May, projections were schools were going to have to eat something close to a $700 per pupil cut to align the state revenues with the spending that had been already appropriated. But as Bob pointed out, the federal resources that had come in really saved the day for K through 12 education, as well as the university and community colleges budgets. So these first bullet points just highlight the balancing of the state budget as it relates to education budgets. So we replaced state funding in these education budgets, both school aid fund as well as state general fund support for universities and community colleges with the CRF funding. That was about a $712 million shift. The rainy day fund and general fund resources were shifted into the school aid fund, about $400 million to keep whole schools. The ongoing appropriations for the education budgets had seen small increases that year for 2020. Those were kept in place through this process, again, with just some fund shifts from the federal resources into these budgets, as well as some resources pulled out of our rainy day fund. The 21 budgets, as Bob pointed out, the governor had set out her 21 proposal weeks before she had to turn around and basically begin shutting down the state and the economy and start to provide a higher level of public health services. The 21 budgets, as they finally were passed, included very small, if at all any, operational increases for K-12 schools, colleges, and universities, kind of just a current services baseline. The 2020 budget, everything that had been funded in there was made whole through, and then just more or less an inflationary increase for that 21 budget. predicting that the 21 budget would be materially impacted by COVID and the needs arising in public schools for help, both operating schools during the remote learning, hybrid learning, but also to keep people safe in the schools. As Bob pointed out, there was nothing in the 20 budget that mentioned virus. And at this point in the K through 12 and education budgets, there wasn't anything in the 21 budget that mentioned COVID. That all changed when the federal government stepped in late December with the supplemental appropriation, the CRRSA, Corona Virus Relief and Recovery Supplemental Appropriation. And schools were pegged at getting about 1.8 billion out of that pot of money for the 2021 fiscal year. Of that 1.8, about 90% is allocated directly by Congress that will go directly to traditional and charter school districts based on the Title 1A federal formula. The use of this formula was, that formula has been in place for years. Congress wanted to get money out to states quickly. The plan was to use an existing formula. This is the largest federal education funding stream, so it made sense to use the federal formula for that purpose. This was also the tool that was used to distribute the CARES Act money in the previous spring. In addition to the direct allocations to districts, there's two pots of discretionary funding that go to the state for the state to decide how to address the virus and the pandemic. Up until this week, both sources of funding, the 1.5 billion as well as the 250 million in discretionary, were tied up in competing supplemental appropriation proposals. The governor had laid out about almost 3 months ago her plan for the use of these resources. The legislature, both the House and Senate, came up with their plans about 2 weeks ago, and earlier this week, we learned that the legislature had passed its version of the supplemental plan, sent it to the governor to chew on. As we know, the governor has acted on those proposals, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. I had this next point in here as a point during our presentation last week on the budget, just hitting home the fact that schools are operating on a different fiscal year than the state budget does. Again, that June 30th year end. Schools are developing their plans right now for how they're going to deal with summer programs, after school programs to help catch kids up. The importance of this funding in those discussions cannot be overemphasized. That money is critical to ensure that districts are going to have the resources necessary. So the longer that the legislature and the governor debate how to use these dollars, really impacts planning that schools can use. The good news is that a significant portion of that money has been freed up through the budget supplemental that was passed and then signed by the governor. So of that 1.5 million or billion direct resources through the Title I formula, about 650 is going to be going out the door fairly soon. The governor vetoed some language in another piece of legislation that has effectively tied up about 840 million of that federal resource, of those federal resources. So those dollars are kind of unappropriated right now. There is some legal maneuvering going on to see if that money can be freed up without action of the legislature. It's questionable. I'm not an attorney, but we will be watching how this plays out. The discretionary dollars that the federal government has made available have gone out under this new supplemental, about 200 million of those. again, reflective of the legislature's priorities, not necessarily the governor's priorities in terms of meeting student recovery, mental health, and out-of-school programs, as well as adding some staffing incentives. And a key piece of the legislature's supplemental appropriation here is to use about $136 million to equalize the per pupil funding allocations that follow through the congressional designated Title I formula. What happens with the use of that Title I formula is that some school districts receive substantially more resources than other districts do, as that formula tends to allocate more resources by design to those schools that have the hardest and the greatest challenges educating their students. Most of these districts reside in urban settings, have high concentrations of economically disadvantaged students. So the fact that Title I biases the resource allocations towards those schools is probably a good thing, because those are the schools that have been hit hardest by the pandemic. However, the formula distorts the allocation such that there really is no clear line between the needs of schools arising out of this pandemic and the Title I formula allocation. So that needs some revisiting, and that's what the legislature did in terms of providing equalization payments to school districts to ensure that at least $450 per pupil is going out statewide. This will bring up a number of districts that were only slated to get about $90, $100 from that supplemental allocation. So now they're guaranteed to receive at least $450 per pupil. This next slide here shows you basically the point that Bob's been hammering home, but bringing it into the school aid arena. The federal resources are just massive by any comparison. Almost 10% of the total allocation in this current year for schools is tied up in the federal dollars. And this is just that federal supplemental that came through in December. The 22 budget doesn't include, at this point, any COVID appropriation. So you can see the CARES funding that came to the state in 20 is represented by the skinny yellow line on the left in the 2021 budget, that roughly $1.7 billion figure, which is all appropriated via this supplemental, is showing up in this 21 bar. And then the 22 budget that the governor's recommended, again, has the COVID money removed. But as Bob's going to share in a little bit, and I'll spoil it, President Biden has and Congress appears to have agreed to a roughly 1.9 trillion rescue plan, the third stimulus plan that would be directing resources to schools. Michigan's anticipated to get another 3.9 billion. So this is more than double the combination of the previous two packages. That'll bring Michigan's total federal funding injection to about 6.2 billion across all three stimulus. So that's the CARES package, the December package, and this package that's waiting the president's signature. In all three packages, the Title I formula is used to distribute 90% of the resources. So about 5.4 billion of that 6.2 is driven by that federal formula. And there's some serious challenges with this federal funding, and specifically the use of the Title I formula. Again, almost all of the money is being directed by Congress to specific school districts. That means states are limited in the ability to use those resources to address the needs where they're the greatest, or as is the case that we're seeing right now, limited the state's ability to equalize the federal resources within the federal resources that are provided. Obviously, states could equalize the federal funding with their own resources, but as Bob pointed out, those resources have been constrained a bit because of the economic situation. And the problems that we've identified, the CRC, with this formula are substantial in that Title I was really designed to address the compensatory education needs, kind of the top off the education needs of students based on the baseline resources that state and local districts provide for students. So the federal government, going back to 1965 and the War on Poverty, designed this program to kind of use it to supplement education dollars coming in from state and local sources. The problem in using that formula for pandemic learning is that all students in the state of Michigan, doesn't matter the size of the school district, doesn't matter where it's located, doesn't matter the governance structure, all students have been affected by the pandemic, and the formula simply does not align the resources to those needs. We've done some analysis that looked at what districts are going to receive as a result of these three packages. The median district across the state, so that's the district at the 50th percentile, will receive about $3,400 per pupil. This is almost half of an annual foundation allowance that a district receives. Annual foundation's just about $8,000. So this is just a hair under that, half of that. But because of Title I, 100 districts are going to receive less than $1,000 per student. So considerably less than the median district. But those districts that Title I is designed under normal operating circumstances to help the most are, not surprisingly, going to do the best under these formulas. So Flint, for example, is going to receive about $42,000 per pupil. This is more, and it amounts to about $158 million total. That is just a staggering amount of money. That's more than 2 times the district's annual budget. The largest school district in the state, Detroit Public Schools Community District, by virtue of the Title I formula, receives 25% of the total Title I pot. So across all three stimulus packages, DPS, CD will receive $27,000 per pupil. And now these are definitely districts that have been hit disproportionately hard by the pandemic. However, it's just, I want to hammer home that, you know, these amounts are in no way related to the actual need. It's the formula that's been used out of convenience and not necessarily the right tool for the job. And we also see that these wide variances are showing up among similar neighboring schools. So we looked at school types, traditional public schools down in Wayne County, and compared what they will get under these proposals to charter schools. And we found that traditional schools that look very similar to charter schools in terms of their student makeup are getting substantially more dollars than their charter school counterparts that are serving the same student population. Our recommendation in looking at the use of these federal dollars is that the state should employ the federal discretionary resources that they have at their disposal to try to allocate at least a base funding amount so all students are served during this pandemic. So let's take a step back. I've kind of hit on some of the specifics of the supplemental. Big picture, this is a massive investment in K through 12 education. About a third of the annual investment will be injected into schools across all three. If we just kind of spread that investment over 4 years, that's about $1.5 billion annually. That's more than double what comes in on an annual basis from the federal government through education funding streams. So this is a massive amount of money coming in. For those districts that are receiving large sums, this is going to be transformative. This is going to go beyond the planning, the use, programming for this money should go beyond just the pandemic learning needs of their students. The decisions and how this money is going to be spent is going to be interesting too. We know with the public health recommendations that schools are going to be needing new staff, whether or not they're certified teachers, parapros. They're going to be bringing in contractors to do work to modify facilities. They're going to be making improvements in capital to improve HVAC. All of these decisions are going to have a material effect on, their budgets, whether or not they're building these things into their ongoing resources or just one-time resources. And we'll be monitoring, those spending decisions and be able to get a sense of where districts are spending their dollars as the money starts to roll in. And the federal government, is allocating this as one-time money, but some analysis that we have done suggests that this money is going to be relevant and part of the debate in school districts for some time. This table here lays out the federal spend of Michigan's roughly $6.2 billion federal investment. You can see that about 40% of this spending is going to be spent after the fiscal year 22 budget has done. So we are going to see that money in the school system for some time. So real quick, I know we'll get back to Bob here. The governor's 22 budget recommendation for schools, universities, and colleges, it's largely an inflationary budget increase. There's a 2% increase across all three budgets. The foundation grant that's the per pupil grant that the state supports. It'll increase by 2% for those at the bottom of the funding ladder, 1% for those districts at the top. We continue to have to make large investments to catch up on our teacher retirement system underfunding. That's a $150 million increase. That would be considered a current service increase. There are no COVID-related appropriations at this time recommended for 2020 in the education budgets. So very similar to what we did with the 20 budget, which was a clean budget, and then supplemented with federal COVID dollars. 21 budget, clean budget, supplemented with federal COVID dollars. We'd expect the same thing to happen with the 22 budget. In terms of specifics, the K-12 per pupil grant, I already talked about that. The governor's recommending a reduction in the cyber school foundation grant by 20%. This is something that she's recommended every year in her budget recommendation. The legislature's rejected that because of the challenges with enrollment in the state of Michigan and parents pulling their kids out of school, whether or not they're doing the learning through a homeschool setup or if they're doing something outside of the public schools sector, private schools, pod learning. We've seen a substantial reduction in enrollment. The state has taken resources and ensured that districts don't feel the fiscal effects of those enrollment declines by changing the way we count students and as well as what weights we give to previous year counts to kind of smooth that thing out. So the chart on your right shows, and I just draw your attention to the 2020, 2021, that's the year we're in. In the fall, we counted about actual heads that showed up for fall enrollment under 1.4 million students. That's the gray bar on the right in the 2021 cluster. If we had been using our regular student count method, that would have said we had about 1.4 million students statewide. Instead, the state is paying on a count method that suggests or that shows that we have 1.45 million students. So that's that middle bar there. And then in 2022, we've got the change in the counting student counting to kind of smooth out that decline that you see at the tail end of this chart. Other school aid highlights, there's an increase for at-risk funding. This is additional resources that are provided to students that are determined economically disadvantaged, and the districts use that to provide programming both in school and out of school for that. We continue to provide increased special ed reimbursements above the Durant minimum. There's a large increase in the state-funded preschool program, bringing the full day rate, which is about $7,200 per student, to $8,200 to align with the basic per pupil grant in the state. So just wrapping up here, looking forward, the big picture, I think, with school finance, based on the supplemental that's been approved in Michigan, as well as this Biden's plan, the 1.9 trillion. The federal education relief dollars are going to just be massive discussion points in school finance, and likely also a discussion at the state capitol on how to allocate the resources that are coming down to both shore up district budgets, but also to equalize budgets for those districts that haven't received the majority, the large allocations under the federal formulas. One question that has been asked: do districts face the prospect of a fiscal cliff? That's the case where, you know, the federal funding just disappears overnight. It's a little different than the last time with the Great Recession, when districts did experience a fiscal cliff. The difference is being that the school aid fund is relatively healthy right now. State appropriations are increasing. So when those federal dollars are removed, the baseline revenues have been increasing, so that the fall off won't be as great. I'd also point out that we aren't using the federal resources to supplant state resources right now. So when those dollars are removed, it won't be that we need to replace the federal resources with state resources to avoid a cliff. And as our analysis points out, with the spend down of those federal resources, there's going to be a much more gradual off ramp as that spending, as districts have those dollars programmed for multiple budget years. As I pointed out, about 40% of this money is going to be spent after fiscal year 22. So districts are going to be spending that over a long period of time, which will reduce the prospects for a fiscal cliff. And then the main advice to state policymakers is to really see how the federal money plays out in district budgets and helping them meet student needs, and then for the state to step in with the resources it has available, both in terms of those discretionary resources, but more importantly, the state resources to really fill in the holes that have been made apparent from the federal resources. So with that, I want to turn it back over to Bob for the wrap up of our presentation.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Craig. Can everyone see my screen? Craig, can you confirm everybody can see?
All good, all good.
Okay, thank you, sir. So we're going to wrap up. I'm going to just very quickly go through some of the other major one-time investments that are included and that we alluded to earlier in the governor's budget recommendation. We'll move through these slides pretty quickly, and then we're going to do a wrap up. Look at kind of the long-term budget situation facing the state, and then turn our attention to the general stimulus funding that was just appropriated, and is awaiting President Biden's signature probably tomorrow with the federal stimulus. The governor's January supplemental to address COVID response did propose some additional small business support. $235 million in general fund to businesses that had either experienced losses or financial strain during the pandemic. That's both grants and then in capital access, depending on low interest capital, depending on the size of the business. 3 different initiatives targeting different business sectors and different micro enterprises, and then other small businesses with $10 million on the side to support the safe reopening of restaurants. That was part of the governor's budget recommendation in January. The legislature went in a different direction. And as we saw this week, and I'm sure many of you that are part of the Lansing Regional Chamber are aware of, the governor vetoed yesterday a separate legislative proposal for tax and fee relief. This would have targeted specific sectors of the business community. That's the afflicted businesses under the definition of the legislature's plan would have included entertainment venues, exercise facilities, restaurants, barbershops and salons, athletic trainers, I think tattoo shops, hotels, and hospitality industry. Those types of sectors that were affected by the pandemic would get basically tax and fee relief. For property tax relief, UI payments, payments into the UI trust fund, and different licensing and regulatory fee relief. The grants that would be provided under the legislature's plan would have been based on a sliding scale, based on loss in gross receipts. So if you lost at least 5% of your gross receipts, you got a lower threshold. I think in order to get the full capped amounts that are listed here, you had to show 50% or more loss in gross receipts. The governor also vetoed separately in that same legislative plan, a $150 million GF contribution to the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund. That was part of the legislative plan. So on business relief, we're kind of back to the drawing board. I know the legislature has tried to override her veto. That failed. They've put some of this funding back into a separate bill, but clearly that will be a point of contention going forward as to how and what type of business relief should be offered, in the finalized budget. Another big increase proposed by the governor that we talked about a little earlier was an increase, was making permanent a $2 an hour wage increase for direct care workers that was initiated at the beginning of the pandemic in April of 2020. And had eventually been extended through February of 2021. The governor's proposal was to make that permanent for the direct care workers currently served by the increase. That cost $110 million in her FY21 supplemental and $360 million in her 22 budget to provide that increase on an ongoing basis. The legislature and the governor signed this change in the supplemental that just passed, provided $150 million and bumped that wage increase up not from $2 an hour to $2.25 an hour. And then expanded the reach and scope of who would get that increase. So beginning under their plan, March 1st, 2021, the increase would be extended to direct care workers and other types of entities. Adult foster care homes for the aged, supported employment arrangements also provided a temporary increase for frontline workers in in foster care residential institutions. The governor did sign that. What's not clear yet is that the governor's proposal was to make that permanent. We'll have to wait to FY22 budget deliberations continue to see if that's also the legislature's intent to make that increase extend into 22. And what was signed yesterday, it covers FY21 only through September 30th of 21. A big proposal for infrastructure in terms of $300 million in one-time general fund for local bridge repair and replacement. It's targeting 120 local bridges that are either in serious or critical condition. This builds on some federal money that has already been put in place for a pilot for this bridge bundling concept, where we do lots of work at once and with the hope of achieving some cost savings in terms of design and contracting in construction. The timeline for this, if approved, and this is still pending with the legislature, obviously, would be for construction work to begin in the spring of 2022, with kind of planning and RFPs being issued late in 2021. There was a significant expansion in our child care subsidy in the state for low-income workers who need subsidized state child care. The state has a program that subsidizes child care currently, and what the governor's proposal would be to extend a temporary increase in income eligibility from 150% of the poverty level to 200% through the end of fiscal year 2022. Her proposal also bumps up reimbursement rates for those daycare providers so that they would get a better reimbursement rate from the state for those services. Also, it's significant to providers. It would also pay providers for the end of calendar year 2020. They would be paid based on enrollment versus actual daily attendance. So if Johnny misses daycare one day, under the way the program is currently implemented, the daycare facility doesn't get reimbursement for Johnny's slot that day. Providers have often advocated for funding that still provides money to the daycare provider during absences, and that's tested out in this plan. That costs $78 million in general fund, and then is supported with some additional child care federal stimulus funding as well in the 21 supplemental. Workforce development programs receive a boost. The Michigan Reconnect program, $120 million in general fund in her budget proposal, that targets adults over 25 who want a 2-year college degree program. The funding put in the budget, along with $60 million from the Talent Investment Fund. I think 30 million of that is already appropriated. The governor would tap the rest of that in fiscal year 2023 under her plan, would support 80,000 students through the end of FY23, and then the Future for Frontliners program, another $60 million in support across the 21 supplemental and the 22 executive budget proposal. Again, this program, which you may have heard of, targets essential frontline workers, and again provides for costs not only for 2-year degree and certificate programs, but for high school completion. And the proposal in the governor's budget is expected to cover another 22,000 workers there. Also provides some additional wraparound supports like childcare and tutoring for participants in both these programs, Reconnect and Future for Frontliners. So let's look ahead and look at what the impact of the FY22 budget recommendation is, and then how FY23 looks, and then we'll turn to that federal stimulus funding that's coming in the door. So the governor's budget proposal for FY22, again, lots of one-time spending, and this slide just basically shows our general fund balance sheet projections looking forward. We talked about those big balances that were going to be brought into FY21. Her supplemental proposals draw down a lot of that balance. We still have about $1 billion left coming into FY22, and then that's largely spent between the ongoing spending and almost $600 million in one-time spending from some of those programs we just went through. Ongoing expenditures exceed ongoing revenues by about $1 billion. We leave FY22 with a very small balance, and looking forward to 23, given projected revenue growth and then known cost pressures, we need to, not only if we maintain ongoing appropriations as recommended by the governor for 22, if we maintain those into FY23 and then recognize some other cost pressures like the loss of the enhanced Medicaid match, the FMAP, as there's federal Medicaid assistance percentage, the loss of that, those savings from the enhanced Medicaid match, some other baseline adjustments from having to back out fund shifts that we're using on a one-time basis in FY22, and then just general state payroll costs. ongoing expenditures will continue to exceed ongoing revenue, we would actually end up with a revenue shortfall, probably in the magnitude, here it's $378 million. These numbers could obviously change, but we're looking at a general fund structural imbalance again in 23 of $300 or $400 million kind of going forward. And again, that assumes no continuation of the FY22 investments we talked about. So local bridges and reconnect and, those one-time expenditures, funding can't be maintained for those in order to, without exacerbating basically that imbalance. So as you've all heard, we also wanted to talk about the new general, Craig talked about the education dollars coming in. We also know the U.S. House finalized a coronavirus relief bill yesterday, and it still includes $350 billion for states and local government for fiscal relief. Those funds remain available through the end of calendar year 2024. And the final bill basically puts the listed bullets here, talk about how can we use this money for coronavirus response, direct response, vaccines, testing, other direct COVID response, but also addressing the negative economic impacts. So that could be business supports, individual supports to help folks deal with the economic impacts of COVID, premium pay for essential frontline workers, up to $13 per hour is allowed. And then, important to the state, it allows the state to provide government services and offset any reductions in revenue when compared to the fiscal year that preceded the pandemic. So for Michigan, that's FY 2019. Any revenue declines we see from FY 2019 going forward through FY 20, 21, 22 can be met with this new stimulus money. Also, specifically, it allows for investment specifically in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. And then presumably the intent to avoid states from using this as as a way to fund tax cuts. It specifically prohibits states from cutting taxes and then backfilling with this new revenue. So the state cannot cut the income tax by 0.5% and then use this to fill in the general fund that would be lost from that state tax rate cut. It also specifically prohibits deposits in pension funds. So this will, for the state budget office, the administration, the legislature, how we use this fund, this new funding is going to dominate thinking for the next months going forward, I'm sure. Some information on Michigan's allocation: $10.3 billion coming to the state, almost $5.7 billion to the state of Michigan itself. The rest shared by local units. I just selectively picked some local counties and cities just to give you an example of the types of money that might be coming at the local level. Ingham County gets just over $56 million, Eaton 21, Clinton 15. In terms of large cities, city of Detroit, it almost gets $880 million from the stimulus. Lansing almost 51, East Lansing about 12. That's from information available through the U.S. House Committee on Oversight and Reform. The stimulus also sets aside money for capital projects. Michigan has been earmarked about $250 million for capital projects. So, additional infrastructure investments can be funded from that allocation. So in terms of making up lost revenue, one thing it'll be very important to get, I think the state will need, and I'm sure is looking for guidance from the U.S. Treasury Department. The provisions that we just talked about are somewhat loose, but in terms of backfilling state revenue, it really draws a line. It says you can spend this to offset revenue losses that are changes from FY19. Well, what do those look like? Well, for our school aid fund, there aren't any. It's actually up. For the general fund, we do experience losses. But if we total those up through FY22, it's a little over $1 billion. So that revenue backfill component is, again, because of the issues we talked about with the revenues kind of perking up, there isn't as much to backfill if you read the letter of the law, at least, in terms of what's in those stimulus provisions. So there will be a lot left over for premium pay, for business and individual supports, for infrastructure per those other provisions. One thing I would note, and I would expect as we go forward to May, we may see a significant downgrade in revenues, where we talked about the dire scenario last May getting much better because of the UI payments. The state of Michigan taxes unemployment insurance benefits, which is what helped pick our revenues up, as we discussed earlier in the presentation. The new stimulus bill for tax year 2020 actually exempts UI benefits up to a threshold of $10,200 for an individual, as long as adjusted gross income is below $150,000. That's going to be a lot of people who are receiving unemployment insurance benefits right now, and it looks like that would flow through, since the state uses adjusted gross income as its tax starting point for the state income tax. It looks like that's going to apply to the state as well. And the implication, Michigan withheld last year almost $500 million tied to UI benefits, and that's just the withholding. I think the thought was we were going to get significant. There were probably going to be significant annual payments in April as folks filed their returns from folks who had received unemployment benefits and had to pay the state income tax share of that. I think estimates I've heard are only about half of those receiving UI benefits actually withhold. So it's really uncertain what the impact of this is going to be, but it does seem like we are going to lose some additional revenue, at least for FY21, as we're going to, as long as folks, the challenge will be many have already filed their returns and are going to have to amend those returns. It's not clear how many will find out and then come back and amend their returns to gain this tax exemption for their UI benefits they may have received. But it could be substantial. This could be $500 million or more dollars in terms of general fund and school aid fund revenue loss coming into May. And I know state treasury officials are trying to dig into this to gauge the implications of that cut. Now, again, any lost revenue would add on to our revenue loss and could be then backfilled with this new stimulus money, but that could draw on additional funding from that $5.7 billion Michigan allocation. So that's going to bring us to the end of our presentation. I hope this was helpful to you today. Craig and I appreciate you joining us today. Just again, just in summary and closing, long term, we have that small structural shortfall. I think the biggest uncertainty is, when does this pandemic end, and when does the economy turn back to normal? Because if the pandemic stretches out or ends sooner than we think, that could drive a lot of changes in our revenue projections and our spending needs, obviously. And then the key question for budget policymakers right now: how do we use those new federal stimulus dollars? We talked about some of the investments in the budget, workforce development to reconnect and the future for frontliners, the infrastructure on roads, direct care workers. You could certainly take this stimulus money and use that in place of general fund for many of those investments. And I'm sure budgeters are examining options right now on all of that. So I thank you for attending today. I'm going to turn things back over to Steve. Appreciate you being with us today. And I think we still have time for questions if there are any. Steve, thank you for having us today.
No, thank you both for going through that. Lots of dollars. raining down from the feds, understanding with COVID 19 and this global pandemic. But we appreciate you guys kind of catching all of it and putting it together in a way, even though there's a lot of information, but just making it, for me too, just being able to consume it. And we appreciate you guys putting together that PowerPoint. And again, for everybody on the call, and for those that may watch this on the Chamber's on-demand webinar site on our website, we'll make sure we get this PowerPoint out to folks and send out this video as well. If you guys don't mind, I know appreciate Craig kind of going back and forth in the chat box, but just for recording purposes, if I can go through a couple of these questions for you guys to answer, that would be very helpful. Is that cool?
Sure thing. Yep.
All right, great. First question, are nonprofits included under the small business umbrella? And this is probably, I think, was asked right when we were going through some of the items that the governor vetoed earlier this week.
Yes. I believe they would be, but you know what? I should probably confirm that. So I don't want to answer that until I know 100%. So Steve, if it works for you, I will confirm that and give you a definitive answer.
Yep.
And then you, if you don't mind, you could pass that along to the attendees today.
Yes.
I believe the answer is yes, but I do want to confirm that before I say that definitively.
Yep, we'll get that out to folks. Next question is, what happens to the unappropriated federal funds due to the veto? Does it go back to the federal government?
Yeah, so I think this one has to do primarily with the federal education dollars that Congress allocated to Michigan. I'll just note the CARES dollars that came to the state last year, and again, through the same vehicle as far as allocation to districts, those federal dollars went through the appropriations process, just like these ones are going through the appropriations process. The key difference was last year, amidst the budget balancing efforts, the legislature agreed to kind of an open-ended appropriation of any federal dollars that would be coming to the state in anticipation of, just that, federal relief. So those dollars weren't allocated in a specific line item, and the legislature didn't have to debate that. This go around, those dollars are being specifically allocated, and there is a difference of opinion and how to allocate those resources and when to allocate those resources, as well as conditions tied to those resources. And this is what's kind of resulted in the line item veto. The governor line item vetoed about $840 million of the roughly $1.7 billion that the Congress has allocated Michigan. Michigan's applied for those resources. We have an application in. So we aren't going to lose those to the federal government until the end of the program, which is in September 2022. So there's still plenty of time to allocate, appropriate those resources to school districts. We'll just see what happens, but they won't be going back to the federal government for some time. I would hope that our policymakers would get their act together and realize the importance of these dollars, especially in the absence of federal state resources to help schools this summer to catch our kids up.
Thank you. This next question is, how can the state or any government dictate to private health care providers, quote, direct care workers, a permanent increase in wages? Will it be subsidized in perpetuity?
So the answer to that is yes, it will be subsidized on a permanent basis. And how this would work would be, and to be clear, the direct care workers we're talking about here are are working through state-funded programs. So in some cases, adult home help workers are a good example. We pay directly in some cases adult home help workers who go into homes of kind of needy, vulnerable adults and take care of daily their daily needs and in the home. And in that case, the state is actually setting the wage and paying those workers directly. Now, most of the workers impacted by this wouldn't fall into that sort of direct contract with the state situation. We would be talking about folks who work for nursing homes, folks who work under contracts for in-home services provided through area agencies on aging, who provide behavioral health services funded through the state behavioral health system. So how that would work would we basically would add this money to the provider contract. So a nursing home, for instance, would get a enhanced reimbursement. And then the contract would be their contract with the state would dictate, this amount shall be passed through to direct care worker wages, and the entity would then have a contractual obligation for those state-funded services, primarily Medicaid-funded services, to meet that mandate. More money in your contract, but we dictate, you need to have you need to make this this wage threshold for your direct care workers. That's generally how that process will work, driven through Medicaid funded state services.
Thank you. I think that I don't see any other questions in either the chat box or the Q&A. So again, thank you to both Robert, Bob, and Craig, and as well as those attendees joining us this morning to go through this state budget. Obviously, you've heard from Bob and Craig. I think this is going to be an ongoing conversation for several weeks now, probably months and years. And with that, again, we'll send out this information either later today or the end of week. And again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks everybody for being here today.